At face value, I'd say issue 96 of Nightwing was a fairly satisfying read, not only because the story finally resolved Nightwing's current battle with his arch nemesis, Blockbuster, but in addition to this, the artwork was nicely paced and very easy to follow. Having said that though, I'd also like to say that this comic was rather idealistic too, as it presented us with a number of scenarios that didn't always make much sense. For instance, near the end of this story, Blockbuster's henchmen are told that their boss owns a private prison which previously treated them badly, very badly. So, instead of them attacking Blockbuster when they eventually confront him, they strangely decide to call him names and drive off into the distance. Which, you know, is fairly common behaviour for most hardened criminals. Along similar lines, I didn't quite understand Dick's fight with Blockbuster either. Not morally, mind you, as it makes a lot of sense for a hero to take on a villain after said villain has corrupted the city and affected its inhabitants. But what doesn't make much sense is how Dick could hold his own against a superhuman foe who could withstand a fall from a 4-story building. After all, a punch is only a punch, but a drop from that height can make anyone go splat, which, come to think of it, is how I'd like to define this issue, as it was more of a splat than a full-on Big Bang. In retrospect, I could use many different words to define this issue of The Flash, issue 786. Words like colourful, because the story was populated with a bunch of colourful characters such as the Titans, the Bat Family, and my personal favourite, the JSA. Frivolous, as the actual plot consisted of a series of frivolous fight scenes where a group of heroes defended the world from an army of villains. And of course, fun, because that's precisely what this comic was all about. It was about fun. Fun, due to the numerous witty interactions it had on offer, ranging from Iris's spiteful yet funny jabs at Damian Wayne, all the way to seeing Linda's nicely designed new Flash persona. In fact, this story was such an entertaining read that its jovial tone inadvertently diluted the dangers faced by Wally and the rest of his crew. Dangers that derived from the Dark Crisis saga, which in itself isn't much of a crisis and isn't very dark. So, let's be fair here, this story didn't totally work as it didn't have much to work with, which in this case was a rather bland crossover event that's populated with some really great characters. Structurally, you could easily divide issue 3 of Daredevil into 3 separate parts. The first part sees Matt trying to persuade Detective Cole North into joining him and Elektra take on the Hand, which to some degree kinda worked. The second part of the adventure then focused on Matt trailing his next possible recruit, Luke Cage, to the offices of the Strongwinds, where both parties have a rather dramatic exchange. Go Team Luke! And last but not least, the final part of the plot sees Daredevil being beaten up by a little girl. But not a normal little girl, because this one is called Aka. She was once Elektra's teacher and she is now part of the Hand. Although she uses her own hand to incapacitate Matt with a single move, before telling him 2 things that stops him in his tracks. The Strongwinds have joined forces with the Hand, and the Punisher is now leading the aforementioned group. Now, all in all, I didn't mind reading this book because the art was appropriately atmospheric and the story set up some really interesting scenarios. Having said that though, the overall adventure did feel rather episodic on the page, structurally at least, as it started out as a recruitment drive, then it progressed to a boardroom confrontation, and then finally it ended with Matt being bitch slapped by a little bitch. I wasn't quite sure about Matt's current state of mind either, as it looks like he's turning into a idealistic hero who doesn't plan ahead and presumes his way is always the right way. Which, yes, sometimes rings true and sometimes rings false, just like this very issue of Daredevil. Throughout the years, DC has produced many different alternate versions of Superman. In 1993, for instance, they published an Elseworlds graphic novel starring a strange Batman-Superman hybrid entitled Superman Speeding Bullet. Then in 2013, Tom Taylor wrote a miniseries that starred an evil version of Superman named Injustice: Gods Amongst Us. And now, thanks to issue 7 of The World's Finest, we have another one to add to our list. Although in this case, the character in question isn't called Clark or Bruce or whatever, and he doesn't come from the planet Krypton either. Instead, he comes from Gotham City, an alternate version of Gotham City, and from the looks of it, he's a young lad named David Sakila, probably pronounced that wrong, who was rocketed to this, our world, by his parents when their world suddenly blew up. Sound familiar? Yes, of course it does, because David's origin story sounds similar to Superman's origin story. Yet, the one thing that separates them both is that David isn't able to use his powers and he seems rather impetuous. So much so in fact, that when they first find him on Earth, Superman, Batman and Robin swiftly take him to the Fortress of Solitude so they can consult with a scientist from the Bottle City of Kandor in order to quell his level of power. Not his temperament, his level of power, which becomes even more apparent when David runs off to... No, I don't want to say any more than that, otherwise I may spoil how this issue ultimately unravels, but what I will say is that I thought this comic book was a really entertaining read, as the artwork was bold, lively and easy to follow. The story was both interesting and intriguing on a number of different levels, and surprise surprise, it featured a costume previously worn by Superman in the 60s when he called himself the Nova. In the year 2000, Mark Waid wrote a really great story called Tower of Babel, which revealed that Batman made a contingency plan to take down the Justice League if anyone managed to corrupt them. But unfortunately, his plan got into the hands of his arch enemy, Ra's al Ghul, and to cut a long story short, this resulted in Batman getting kicked out of the League and prompted him to reflect on his own actions. After all, who's going to take down Batman if someone managed to control him? The Justice League perhaps? Well, maybe, but will they be able to stop Batman if he already has plans to take them down? So, upon this realization, Batman created a failsafe of his own, namely the Batman of Z&R, who, stripped of his Bruce Wayne persona, would be able to defend the world from, well, his other self, by creating an unstoppable robot called Failsafe to take on Batman if he ever did anything wrong. Like, kill the Penguin for instance, which explains why Bruce has now reverted to his Z&R persona so he can defend himself from the previously mentioned robot. The one problem with this, however, is that Z&R prevented himself from defeating Failsafe by removing all knowledge of how he initially created him. But don't worry folks, because by the end of this issue, someone else turns up to help Bruce out. Someone who's really super. Although not as super as this amazing issue of Batman, one that was dramatically illustrated, exciting to read, and left me wanting to see what happens next. Similarly, I can say the same thing about the Catwoman backup feature too, but in this case, the story in itself was short but sweet, and without giving too much away, was rather refreshing as it resolved the current Catwoman Penguin storyline in a personal yet poignant manner.